9. Lockheed P38 Lightning. The American-built Lockheed P38 Lightning is a single-seat twin-engine fighter aircraft that was originally developed for the US Army Air Corps in the late 1930s. It found widespread use during World War II in various combat roles, including as a general fighter, a night fighter, a bomber, and a long-range escort fighter. The P-38 saw its biggest successes in the Pacific Theater, where it served as the US military's primary long-range fighter until the introduction of new aircraft toward the end of the war. Many P-38s were shot down or crashed for other reasons during the war. One of them, identified as 4212647, saw extensive combat in Papua New Guinea. Nicknamed Dottie from Brooklyn, in honor of the wife of its pilot Lieutenant Cornelius Corky M. Smith, the plane took off on June 21, 1943, from the 3-mile drome near the island's southern coast. Smith shot down 3 Japanese planes before rejoining the rest of his squadron and flying back toward the base. He noticed during the return trip that his engines were beginning to overheat. In early 1944, an unnamed pilot took off from Port Moresby and soon lost power to both engines. He was forced to land the plane on some salt flats north of the base. Various sections of the aircraft were recovered during several salvage missions in the late 1970s, and they ended up in different places, including the Papua New Guinea War Museum. 8. Hawker Hurricane. Designed during the 1930s for the British Royal Air Force, RAF, the Hawker Hurricane is a single-seater fighter aircraft that played a bigger role in the Allied war effort than it typically gets credit for. While another plane, called the Supermarine Spitfire, is better remembered for its role in the Battle of Britain in 1940, the Hawker Hurricane was responsible for an estimated 60% of the losses inflicted on the Luftwaffe throughout the campaign. RAF pilot Officer Desmond Clark was flying one of the overlooked aircraft when his plane was hit. He parachuted to safety while his plane crashed into a field, where it was left in place and forgotten about. In 2019, archaeology students from Winchester University excavated the downed Hurricane from a privately owned field, where it had sat nearly untouched for 80 years. They recovered parts of the cockpit instrumentation, a control column firing button that was set to fire, an identification plate confirming that it's the plane Clark was flying, and the harness release, which would have been the last thing Clark handled before jumping out with his parachute. As part of the project, the students also searched for the pilot's surviving relatives in hopes that they could help tell Clark's story. 7. B18 Bomber. The Douglas B-18 Bolo was a medium-range bomber that served under the US Army Air Corps and the Royal Canadian Air Force in the late 1930s and early 1940s. It was quickly becoming outdated by 1940, as more advanced bombers that could fly longer ranges and carry heavy bomb loads were developed. During the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the US military lost many of its B-18s. The remaining planes were incapable of going on bombing missions and were instead assigned to transport and patrol duty and used in training exercises. In early 1942, a B-18 crew was sent out to conduct anti-submarine patrol along the New England coast, where German U-boats were mercilessly sinking American merchant ships. During the return flight, the crew encountered blinding snow squalls and winds that blew the plane 150 miles off course. It didn't help that the pilots were used to flying B-24 bombers and were inexperienced with the B-18. They mistakenly believed that they were out over the Atlantic Ocean, so when the clouds broke and they saw a city below, they thought it was Providence, Rhode Island. But it was actually Concord, New Hampshire, and unbeknownst to the crew, the course they were following would not take them to the field where they were supposed to land. While flying at 3,800 feet, 1,158 meters, the plane collided with Mount Waternomi, barreling through snow and trees along the way. By the time the aircraft came to a full stop, it had lost a wing and its body was split open. An engine fire broke out and eventually reached the bombs on board, resulting in numerous explosions that nearby residents overheard. Miraculously, 5 of the 7 men managed to survive the wreck. Locals immediately embarked on a rescue mission, trudging through snow for hours before they encountered the survivors, several of whom were seriously injured. Using toboggans, they made numerous trips up and down the mountain to transport the men to safety. The mangled wreck remains at the remote site to this day, where it sits along an unofficial and unmaintained hiking trail that relatively few people dare to venture. Would you be willing to hike to this spot to see the wreck for yourself? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 6. ATKA B24D Liberator. Also known as the Model 32, the consolidated B24 Liberator is an American heavy bomber that was used extensively throughout World War II. It's the most produced heavy bomber and multi-engine aircraft in history. Despite being difficult to fly and having poor low-speed performance compared to other bombers at the time, the British Royal Air Force (RAF) routinely used the B-24 Liberator for transatlantic flights. It also operated under every branch of the US military and played a significant role in the Allied war effort in both the Western European and Pacific theaters. But it was rendered obsolete by the war's end, and there are only 13 surviving Liberators today, several of which are either derelict or only partially intact. One of them can be found on Adka Island in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. Its crew was on weather reconnaissance duty when they encountered harsh conditions and realized they wouldn't be able to land in a nearby field like they'd originally planned. The pilot managed to land the aircraft on its belly, even after its tail ripped off in mid-air. Fortunately, everyone emerged from the ordeal unscathed except one crew member, who suffered a fractured collarbone. They spent the night at the crash site, where they were able to build a fire and had enough food with them to hold over until rescue arrived. The Navy picked them up the next day. The wreck remains in place to this day. It's been on the National Register of Historic Places since 1979 and is part of the Aleutian Islands World War II National Monument. 5. Supermarine Spitfire. The British-built Supermarine Spitfire was a short-range defensive fighter aircraft that was originally designed for use in and around the area it was stationed in. It's the only Allied aircraft that fought along the front lines of World War II from the very beginning to the very end of the conflict. In 1939, the British Expeditionary Force (BEF) became stranded and in need of rescuing along the beaches near the French port of Dunkirk. The troops had traveled to France with plans to defend the country, but were quickly surrounded by the Germans, leaving them with no other choice but to evacuate. On day 1 of the evacuation, codenamed Operation Dynamo, squadron leader Jeffrey Stevenson flew Spitfire N3200 on what turned out to be its first and only mission. He managed to shoot down a German aircraft before his plane was shot down, forcing him to crash land at a beach where he was captured as a prisoner of war. Over the years, the downed aircraft sank into the sand and out of sight, where it sat forgotten until 1986, when strong currents revealed it for the first time in more than 45 years. Archaeologists excavated the wreck that year and were surprised to find that it was remarkably intact, although few parts of it could be salvaged. In 2000, a dedicated team started working to restore the Spitfire to its former glory. It was no easy undertaking, but in 2014, the plane that spent decades buried along a French beach took to the skies. 4. F4U Corsair. The American-made Vought F4U Corsair fighter plane went on its first combat missions in 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign in the South Pacific. It was used mainly as a carrier-based aircraft throughout World War II and the Korean War, meaning it operated mainly from naval aircraft carriers. Known for its effectiveness, the Corsair even had a reputation among the Imperial Japanese military for being one of World War II's most formidable American fighter planes. During its operational period, the plane was in high demand. It was a top choice among the French, British, New Zealand, Argentine, Honduran, and other militaries. Nearly 12,600 of the aircraft were made throughout its 11-year production run. As popular as the Corsair was, it wasn't immune to mechanical problems. One pilot learned this during a routine training mission over Hawaii in 1948, when his plane began sputtering. The engine failed, but he was luckily able to land the aircraft safely and smoothly in the waters off Honolulu. He maneuvered the plane so gracefully that it wasn't even damaged during the emergency landing. The pilot swam to shore in a life jacket while the Corsair sank beneath the waves. Today, the wreck sits roughly 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers off the Oahu coast. Decades of being immersed in seawater has taken a visible toll on the aircraft, and at first glance it looks like all that's left of it is the fuselage. One of the wings also remains but is buried beneath the sea bottom. Despite its decaying condition, the Corsair is a popular sight for divers and underwater photographers. It's home to thriving populations of garden eels, jacks, stingrays, and other marine creatures who have repurposed the plane as an artificial reef. 3. Aichi E13A. The Aichi E13A was a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft that was used from 1941 to 1945. It was designed to carry 3 crew members and could hold up to 550 pounds, 250 kilograms of bombs. Over 1,400 of the seaplanes were manufactured during the war, but there are no airworthy examples known to survive today. One of the few Aichi E13A wrecks that can still be seen today was shot down by US forces during the more than 2-month-long Battle of Palau in the South Pacific. The plane sank to the seafloor in the waters off the state of Koror and remains at the site to this day. It's remarkably intact for its age, even though time and the elements have taken a considerable toll on it, and is a popular diving site. Images of the wreck have circulated on social media in recent years, sparking discussions about how hard it is to imagine a violent war going on in a place that seems like a tropical paradise. In that sense, the sunken aircraft serves as a visible reminder of how the atrocities of war can interrupt life and wreak havoc on a small, peaceful place that feels far removed from the rest of the world. 2. Lockheed B34 Ventura. The American-built Lockheed B34 Ventura was a twin-engine medium bomber and patrol bomber that first entered service in 1942 under the British Royal Air Force, RAF. It served under the US Navy in the Pacific Theater starting in 1943, and was also used by the US Army Air Corps. The plane was designed for coastal anti-submarine patrol, but it served several other functions, including as bomber trainers and navigational trainers. 16 B-34s were fitted as target tugs. Their job was to pull a target while pilots in training practiced taking runs at it with different colored ammunition. The markings left on the target were used for gauging the trainee's progress. During a routine flight over Rhode Island on August 5, 1943, a B-34 target tug lost one of its engines and crashed on Wolf Hill in the town of Smithfield. Witnesses later said that the aircraft appeared to be circling overhead in search of a safe landing place before it landed at the crash site. Several heavy explosions ensued as locals rushed to the downed plane. Sadly, all 3 men aboard, Lieutenant Saul Winston, Lieutenant Otis R. Porterwig, and Sergeant Herbert D. Booth, lost their lives. The military initially released few details about the crash, and it was soon forgotten as the war intensified. Since then, the wreck site has been turned into a memorial and is now accessible to the public. 1. P47 Thunderbolt. Produced between 1941 and 1945, the American-built Republic P47 Thunderbolt was one of World War II's heaviest fighter aircraft, with a fully loaded weight of around 8 tons, 7.3 metric tons. It was one of the main fighters to operate under the US Army Air Corps, and also served for other Allied forces, including France, the UK, and the Soviet Union. The P-47 operated mainly as an escort fighter in short to medium-range high-altitude air-to-air combat and ground attack missions in both the European and Pacific theaters. Over 15,000 were built, but only around 60 of the aircraft remain intact today. Air Corps pilot Lieutenant Robert Boyd was flying a P-47 along the American East Coast on June 29, 1944, when he forgot to switch to his auxiliary fuel tanks and ran out of gas. He crash-landed along Ocean Isle Beach in North Carolina and was fortunate enough to walk away from the wreck uninjured. At the time, the area was sparsely populated. The downed plane was left at the crash site, where it became buried in the sand. Over the years, parts of the wreck were occasionally exposed. But local residents didn't get a chance to see the P-47 in its entirety until 2000, when a bad storm unearthed more of it than ever, prompting local officials to order an excavation. With nowhere to keep the plane, the town donated it to the Carolina History of Aviation Museum in Charlotte. Thanks for watching. Do you know of any other planes that went down in World War II that belong in a video like this? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.